At noon on Thursdays, we stop for 15 minutes to focus on a particular work of art. And today I chose to talk about Mary Cassatt, our beautiful portrait of a young girl named Simone from about 1903. Mary Cassatt is a name I imagine that many of you know. A tremendous American impressionist. She was the first American impressionist to go to Paris and who was really accepted by the circle of impressionists. She knew Manet. She was very close with Edgar Degas. Edgar Degas was a great mentor to her. There's a very famous portrait by Degas of Mary Cassatt standing in the gallery at the Louvre with an umbrella kind of sticking out, very elegantly dressed. So she was a real trailblazer, and she was a trailblazer also, of course, because she is a woman. You know that even today it continues to be that way, but certainly when we're talking about 19th century, early 20th century artists, we're mostly talking about men. Women were really, being trailblazers, those who were successful and were able to show. It was still very much thought for a woman to be at home with her family and not to be working. And so we really look at Mary Cassatt as such an extraordinary woman. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Mary Cassatt before we look specifically at the painting. She was born in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh in the city of Allegheny. She was born to a very wealthy family. Her father worked in finances, and they were able to switch various homes during her childhood, from the city to the country, and buying bigger homes as she grew up. And one of the really interesting things about her childhood is that her family was supportive of her artistic career. As you can imagine, as an adolescent, she showed great promise through her drawings and paintings, and her family encouraged her to study. She studied for several years at the Pennsylvania Academy for Fine Arts, an institution that welcomed many great artists who are on exhibit in our Art of North America galleries. Specifically, Thomas Eakins is probably the most famous artist to have been associated at this time in the late 19th century with the Pennsylvania Academy. But Mary Cassatt wanted more. She really had great ambition for her work. She didn't want to just study in the U.S., and she convinced her parents to support her on a trip to Europe. And when she traveled to Paris, her life was forever changed. She spends the majority of her adult life in Europe, predominantly in Paris, but she also travels to Madrid, where she's very inspired by the great works of the old masters, and specifically she's inspired by Velázquez and many of his works. Rubens, the paintings of Rubens were also a great influence. As I mentioned, as a matter of introduction, she becomes quite chummy with the other impressionists in Paris, and she exhibits with them, which is really tremendous. On view in this gallery of Art of North America, this whole wall here that also includes our Mary Cassatt is really American artists interpreting French Impressionism. We do have a Diego Rivera work on this wall as well, a Mexican painter who was also inspired by French Impressionism, a little known fact. But, more than Theodore Robinson or William Merritt Chase, Mary Cassatt became a part of this Impressionist circle. When you look at our portrait of Simone, it might surprise you a little bit. Mary Cassatt, really any great museum in the United States, whether it's the Met or the Nelson Atkins or the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, has a painting by Mary Cassatt. And they're usually a bit painted more finely. Here, this is very sketch-like. You see the loose brush strokes that are characteristic of many of her works. Remember, she was an impressionist, but they're usually kind of filled in completely, right? This painting seems to have some kind of loose elements to it. It's not as tight as her work of the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. But it is very typical of her work of this period at the turn of the century, and also very typical of one of her favorite subjects, portraits of children. Simone, this is, as I mentioned, a portrait of Simone. Simone is a young girl that Mary Cassatt drew or painted over 20 times in her career, which is not unusual. In our gallery next door, we have a painting by Robert Henry of Bernadita. Henry sketched Bernadita often. I guess if you find a good model, you stick with them. And certainly that is the case with Simone for Cassatt. But as you probably know, Cassatt was really taken with children and was really taken with scenes of mothers and children. She was not a mother herself, which that also kind of is not unusual, right? The great Frida Kahlo was an artist that painted mother and children. She painted children, but she was not a mother herself. So she has her own kind of take on the situation. It's not necessarily her portraits of mothers and children, or children in the case of Simone, is not a manifestation of her own personal experience. However, when we think about the late 19th century, early 20th century, it's certainly a representation of her environment. One of the great photographers, first women photographers, a British woman by the name of Julia Margaret Cameron, also always depicted children, often mothers and children. And we always say, art historians always say it's because that's what she knew. Those were the people that she knew. That's what she was around the most often. And the same is true for Cassatt. Cassatt had more easy access to her intimate scenes of mothers and children than she had access to brothels, right? Or even the cafe life in Paris. She was a wealthy American woman. She did go to cafes and things, but it was a little, she was also not as welcome. She wasn't given the great pass that some of her male contemporaries were to those kinds of environments. So then it makes sense that mothers and children become such an important part of her work. But I do think there's more to it. And one of the things that's so wonderful about Mary Cassatt's work that's evident in our Simone is rarely do you see a Cassatt portrait in which the sitter is looking directly at you, exchanging the gaze. Cassatt really specifically, with lots of intention, portrayed her sitters looking off to the side, looking down, looking up, but not directly exchanging the view exchanging the view of the spectator, right? The gaze. And certainly the gaze is something that we talk about all the time when we talk about the representations of women. How have women historically been portrayed by predominantly male artists? And then how do women artists either break that mold or stay with that mold when they represent themselves? And in that way, Cassatt was drawn to creating, portraits of women and their children in these quiet, very intimate moments. Of course, we can think about this idea of innocence, but also sort of freedom, the freedom to be themselves without the trappings or stress of adult life, right? In terms of the 19th century, children, particularly girls, were very popular. We have several portraits of young girls in our collection. Theodore Robinson, who painted this landscape here, another American artist inspired by French Impressionism. We have a portrait of a little girl. It's called a marauder, a thief, basically. And we also have behind you, we have our Thomas Eakins painting, Elizabeth with a dog. My colleague Andrew can point to it. He's standing right there. And there's a show I want to tell you about, a new show happening later this year at the Newark Art Museum that it will be traveling our country, called Angels and Tomboys. And it will include the work of Cassatt and Thomas Eakins. And it's the first show ever to focus on how American artists were really focusing on young girls and portraying young girls in their work, and how it can be not just as objects, right, as objects of femininity, but meaning something more, and maybe a symbol of our culture in the 19th century, maybe a symbol whimsical, or the certain freedom that Cassatt experienced when not only with her subjects, the subjects of mothers and children, but the way in which she paints, the loose brushstrokes, the green, pink, blue, and gray of this composition, I think are particularly striking. A couple of other things I wanted to share with you is that, as I mentioned, Cassatt painted Simone on several occasions. I'm going to pass this around so you see it. I have 4 different portraits of the young Simone to share with you. I'll hand that to Richard. And then one in particular that I've brought that's much bigger. This one here with the blue bonnet. This is at the Rhode Island School of Design at their museum. And you can see we have Simone wearing a much more elaborate hat than the simple bonnet in our own portrait, this feathered hat. Also very typical of Cassatt's portraits. You know, this is a prop. You know, whether or not this bonnet, maybe it did belong to Simone, but she played with props with the children that she often portrayed. So I'll pass this over to you. And there was another girl. So Simone obviously has this very pretty blonde hair. There was another young woman at the same time, Margaret, that there are several portraits of by Cassatt, and she was a brunette. So I think that, you know, Cassatt had her favorites and clearly chose 2 different looking girls. But I was thinking, you know, whenever I talk about Cassatt, I just think of her as such an amazing woman for her time and how she really broke through the, you know, French-dominated circle of Impressionists and how she gained the support of her family. You know, there are letters that her father wrote in the 1870s to his friends bragging about the fact that Cassatt was winning medals in art competitions and also bragging that she was so accomplished in French literature. Cassatt's mother spoke fluent French. She was also had many literary motivations, an active writer and reader. And I just think that Cassatt's life reminds me of someone a little more close, a little more local, and that's Alice Klauber. And Alice Klauber, this is a work in our collection, a charcoal drawing of a girl looking forward. So also I think this makes the point of how special it is that Cassatt made the artistic choice never to have her girls looking, or rarely to have her girls looking forward. But this is a little bit later piece, and I'll pass this around as well, a charcoal drawing in our collection. You can see that, as I said, many, many artists have been drawn to portray children, but Alice Klauber was a local trailblazer. And at the turn of the century and in the early 20th century, here in San Diego, she traveled to Europe. She went to Spain with the American painter Robert Henry. She was very involved in promoting the California plein air artists, many of whom are presented in this gallery. And she was also very instrumental to the founding of our Asian art collection here at the museum and encouraged the collection of Asian art. So I like to think of her as an artist and also an art promoter in the sense that she championed both American and French painting locally, or American and Asian art locally, and had traveled to Europe and had these experiences. And so I just wanted to kind of end on that note and thinking about that Mary Cassatt, this name we know so well, and is, as I said, represented in so many museums, that locally, too, we have someone in Alice Klauber. And the painting right kind of next to this work in the other room, we have our Robert Henry painting that is dedicated to Alice Klauber. So I like that our reference to Alice Klauber is not too far from our reference to Mary Cassatt. And so thank you.